Okay, so I'm very happy to welcome everyone to our talk today. I'm also very honored and happy to introduce our speaker. He is a former student of mine and of others as well at Columbia University. So a PhD in, I was looking this up.
5 years ago.
5 years ago, I can't remember, from the Department of History. He got his PhD in international global history track, but he did global Asia, global China. And we'll see a little bit of that in his talk today. He is currently the professor of history, assistant professor of history at the National University of Singapore in the history department there. And he was just explaining that he just finished teaching his modern China class just before he arrived here. So he's also teaching modern Chinese history at NUS. But he's also the author of this recent book, Diasporic Cold Warriors, Nationalist China, Anti-Communism, and the Philippine Chinese from the 1930s to the 1970s. And this book is a wonderful study that very much reflects Chien Wen's interest in kind of globalizing the study of China, not doing China simply within borders, and to kind of think about the regional relationship among different groups of Chinese, diasporic Chinese in the long 20th century. So I'm hoping that his talk today, which I don't have the title for it, but he will share it with us, will be an expansion of or a part of this book.
It's
okay.
more or less a summary of the book.
It's a book talk, so why don't I just hand over the reins to Chien Wen? So nice to have you here with us. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm gonna share screen. And there we go. All right. Thank you so much, Eugenia, for that very generous introduction. And suffice to say, I am absolutely delighted to be back at Columbia and in this room, which I have many fond memories of. So I'm gonna talk today about my book, Diasporic Cold Warriors, which came out last year with Cornell University Press, and which is also part of the studies of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute series. The book explains how and why in the second half of the 20th century, at the height of the Cold War, the Philippine Chinese, one of the smallest Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, became the most ardent diasporic supporters of the Republic of China on Taiwan and its ruling Chinese Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, in the region, possibly the world. So for all of the fears of Chinese communism at the time among governments in Southeast Asia, the quote-unquote China, which intervened the most extensively in any Southeast Asian country during this period, was not the People's Republic, but the Republic of China. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the narrative of the book before delving into some of its key arguments. Thanks. My story begins. My story begins.
If it does,
Okay. Okay. It should be fine. Okay. So my story begins in the first half of the century, during which the Kuomintang institutionalized itself in the Philippines and clashed with pro-CCP Chinese left-wing organizations in the years leading up to the Japanese occupation. Notably, during this period, the Philippine Kuomintang became dominated over time by a right-wing faction with ties to the quasi-fascist blue shirts in China. the Secretary General of the Kuomintang in Taiwan from 1985 to 1987, so a pretty pivotal period in Taiwan's history, right? This gentleman, Ma Sule, was briefly part of this right-wing faction that emerged in the Philippines. By the end of the 1940s, however, just following the Second World War, following the Japanese occupation of the country, and following what the Kuomintang called a period of bloody struggle between left and right-wing factions in the Philippines, the majority of left-wing Philippine Chinese leaders had returned to China. And because obviously the Chinese Civil War from the communist point of view had been going pretty well, and so these left-wing leaders decided to throw in their lot with revolutionaries on the mainland. And so Chinese communism in the Philippines had more or less by this point been extinguished as an institutionalized above ground presence. And this is what enabled Taipei to consolidate its hold over, again, as I mentioned, one of the smallest overseas Chinese communities in the region, right? With the participation of the Philippine government, a government that had recently gained its independence from the United States, and that was quite staunchly anti-communist. I will explain subsequently, however, how the United States was not a big player in this narrative. This is a Cold War narrative, but not one that quite fits with how we understand the Cold War in this part of the world. So those are publications by left and right-wing Chinese groups, respectively. Nationalist China's influence in the Philippines was characterized by its near hegemony over Chinese education and key community institutions, including the Federation of Filipino Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, the Kuomintang itself, which had branches throughout the archipelago, at institutions such as Chiang Kai-shek High School or College in Manila, and in institutions like the Philippine Chinese Anti-Communist League, or PCACL, whose coat of arms you can see on the screen there. And so it was through these organizations that Taipei mobilized the Philippine Chinese, most of whom, and this is kind of important, most of whom were legally Chinese nationals, right, in support of its overarching goal of counterattacking the mainland and opposing communism and resisting Russia. During these decades, so we're talking here about the 1950s to 70s, visits to Taiwan were, such as you see here, were quite common. The cover of my book is actually based on the photo on the left, which shows Chiang Kai-shek greeting Philippine Chinese students who were in Taiwan for something called military service, or Junzhong Fu, in 1956. And on the right is a photo of a Philippine KMT member presenting Chiang Kai-shek with a gold three-dimensional map of China in 1950. So this was in fact the first, he was part of the first ever overseas Chinese delegation to visit Taiwan following the KMT's retreat there. This was in August 1950, if I recall correctly. More perniciously, the Kuomintang collaborated with the coercive apparatus of the Philippine state, in particular its military intelligence, to silence dissenting and heterodox voices within the community by identifying them as quote-unquote communists or pro-communist. And many such persons ended up being deported to Taiwan, including the two people you see on this slide, Quintin and Rizal Yutong of the Chinese Commercial News. The Chinese Commercial News was the Philippines' most widely read Chinese language newspaper at the time, one of 4 Chinese broadsheets in the country. And the crime of these newspaper editors was to have, as liberals, right, provided balanced news coverage of developments in China and Taiwan, and also to have advocated for Chinese cultural integration into the Philippine nation state, right, in opposition to the KMT's Sinocentrism. They envisioned a multicultural Filipino nation in which the Chinese were a were not aliens, but instead members of. And this is a absolutely fascinating document that I unearthed in multiple archives. It was what we might call a smoking gun document because it detailed Kuomintang involvement in the case. I found it in multiple archives, including the papers of Ma Shuli at Stanford, but also at Academia Historica in Taipei. So my book ends with these two men in the early 1970s, after which things changed. So under martial law in the Philippines, which was about 50 years ago, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., not his son, who's the current president of the Philippines, Marcos Sr. vastly simplified the naturalization process for foreign nationals in 1972. You will recall that most Chinese in the Philippines, most ethnic Chinese in the Philippines at the time were legally nationals of the Republic of China, and I'll explain why shortly. And so Marcos simplified the nationalization process as part of his efforts to establish formal diplomatic relations between Manila and Beijing in 1975, right? This is around the time that multiple Southeast Asian countries sort of switched their recognition as well. And so following the early to mid-1970s, Kuomintang influence in the Philippines waned as ties between the Philippines and the other China expanded. And that's how we get to the present day, although it's the present day that I refer to in my conclusion, but which I'm not, I don't talk about that extensively. So that's the narrative. That's the narrative of the book. And I will now talk about the main arguments of the book. Three main arguments. One question that came up as I was revising my dissertation for publication was how to position myself in relation to what kind of existing scholarship, how to craft a meaningful argument that spoke to scholars in different fields. And this was a tricky question given that my topic does not fit easily into area studies subfields, such as China or Southeast Asia, or even Chinese migration history, much of which has been about an earlier period in history. So I had to pick and choose my scholarly arguments carefully, and in the end, for practical reasons, I settled on three major interventions. So the first intervention is actually addressed at historians of modern China and Taiwan, particularly those in Anglo-American academia, those that I read extensively and interacted extensively with in graduate school, which seems like a long time ago. And these persons, in other words, persons who've written about the Kuomintang chiefly from an area studies perspective of its nation-building strategies and ideology during the Nanjing decade, right, during the 1930s, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, and to a lesser extent in Taiwan after 1945 and after 1949. And this is how I encountered, and I think how most of us have encountered the KMT in graduate school, right, through scholarship by the likes of Brian Sway and Maggie Clinton on fascism and conservatism in the 1930s. And this is typically, I think, how historians and the general reading public envision the party today. And so in my conversations with China historians, for example, they frequently express surprise that there was a Kuomintang in the Philippines at all. That said, if you read Kuomintang propaganda from the 1930s onwards, you will or dig into its archives or that of the Republic of China's foreign ministry, it becomes readily apparent that the party's state from about the 1930s onwards set great store by the mobilization of persons it designated as overseas Chinese, or Huaqiao. Its 1929 nationality law, which was actually only modified in the year 2000 when the DPP came to power in Taiwan. This nationality law, formally defined as Chinese nationals, quote unquote, according to the principle of blood right citizenship, or jus sanguinis. The overseas Chinese, after all, you may have heard this expression, the overseas Chinese, after all, was supposedly the mother of the revolution, right? Huaqiao wei geming zhimu, according to Sun Yat-sen himself, although my colleague in the NUS History Department, Huang Jianli, has actually explained that Sun Yat-sen never actually uttered that exact phrase. So what I've done is go back to some, a slightly older and less sizable, less fashionable, I guess, body of scholarship on the Kuomintang in Southeast Asia and the Americas. And I do so in order to make the case or for understanding the party state as a networked and transnational organization that connected China and Taiwan to so-called Chinese communities abroad. And even though these networks overlapped with and leveraged the migration networks that my former advisor Adam McKeown and other historians of the Chinese diaspora have studied, the Kuomintang was very much a different kind of transnational formation. One whose, as you can see from the flowchart on the right, which is from my book, one whose branches, schools, affiliated civic institutions, and diplomatic organs were both embedded in overseas Chinese societies, or what the Kuomintang referred to as Haiwai, right? As well as linked hierarchically to the center, Zhongyang, whether or not that center was in Nanjing or Chongqing or from 1949 onwards in Taipei. And so I think thinking about the Kuomintang transnationally underscores the territorial incompleteness of this peculiar entity that we call the Republic of China, at least in the eyes of the party state's partisans. It underscores the partial sovereignty of the Republic from its inception in 1912. And this, I think, explains the party state's constant turning outwards towards Nanyang, right, and elsewhere in search of support. One question that I get asked a lot is about the other side. Can we think about the CCP/PRC diasporically? So my book, especially from the 1950s onwards, focuses more on the Kuomintang and anti-communism than on Chinese left-wing movements, given that in the Philippines, at least, these Chinese left-wing movements more or less vanished after the late 1940s. I will say that we can and need to think about Chinese communism diasporically. My friend Tom Wocho at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore has pointed this out in her wonderful book, Migration in Time of Revolution. But I would argue that despite the presence of ethnic Chinese CCP sympathizers overseas, both alleged and actual, the CCP was not as formally institutionalized diasporically, right? You didn't have sort of CCP branches operating overseas, not unlike the KMT, right? Unlike KMT branches. So the CCP wasn't as formally institutionalized as diasporically to the extent that the Kuomintang was. And moreover, I would argue that the Kuomintang, unlike the Kuomintang, the CCP after 1949 focused on nation building in a more conventional territorialized sense. From the mid-1950s onwards, it officially jettisoned its ethno-legal ideological claims upon the Chinese diaspora, following the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference. Conversely, the Republic of China engaged in no such active repudiation. As I mentioned earlier, it maintained blood right citizenship until the year 2000. So that's my first intervention. My second is about understanding the complicated three-way relationship between the Philippine state, the ROC state, and the Philippine Chinese, and using this relationship to rethink the Cold War in East Asia. I found the work of political scientist Stephen Krasner pretty useful here. And so drawing upon some of his work, I argue that Taipei and Manila relations with respect to the Philippine Chinese amounted to an arrangement of what Krasner calls shared sovereignty, whereby, and this I'm quoting Krasner here, recognized national political authorities voluntarily cooperate with external actors such as states or regional and international organizations to jointly manage a particular issue. So I argue in the book that using this concept, I try to argue in the book that the relationship was not one that can be characterized as neo-colonial, even though the term neo-colonial gets used a lot to describe the US presence in the Philippines after 1946. And the reason for this is that the relationship was a marriage of convenience characterized by shifting but crucially relatively equal power relations between Taipei and Manila. by the willingness of the Philippine authorities to allow the Kuomintang to operate openly in the Philippines. By the willingness of the authorities in the Philippines to collaborate with the Kuomintang and the Chinese community to construct this bogeyman of Chinese communism. Manila relied on ROC officials, it relied on grassroots KMT activists because its own military intelligence forces were ignorant of the Chinese. And so they needed, in effect, to outsource the policing and surveillance of Chinese society to the Kuomintang, which is more than happy to oblige. And Taipei lacked the means, crucially lacked the economic and political leverage to impose itself on the Philippines without the consent of the post-colonial state. And Taipei was acknowledged this. And this is made clear, I think, by the proscription of the Kuomintang in other Southeast Asian countries, including countries that were quite anti-communist, but which nonetheless came to view the Kuomintang presence on the ground with suspicion, countries like Malaya, Thailand, and South Vietnam. Right? And this is what I think makes the Philippines distinct as a case study. It's not that the authorities were anti-communist and suspected the Chinese residents of communist sympathies, but that they tolerated and were willing to collaborate with the Kuomintang. And this does not obtain elsewhere in Southeast Asia to the extent that it obtains in the Philippines. So shared sovereignty, this concept that I borrow from Krasner, is also useful for me in pushing back and engaging with scholarship on the Cold War in the region. So my book aligns to a large extent with scholarship by the likes of An Cheng-Guan and Liu Wenqing, right, who have called attention to how important the fears of the PRC were and the overseas Chinese as potential fifth colonists were to understanding the dynamics of the Cold War in this part of the world. But on the other hand, and this might come as a bit of a surprise, this is not a US-centric narrative. Even if the states involved were close allies of the United States. And so the US is not absent from this book, which actually draws quite a lot on US archival materials, but materials that I found at places like College Park and at Stanford suggest that US involvement in the Philippine Chinese community during this period was chiefly that of an observer and did not go very far beyond disseminating print propaganda. But it was the Kuomintang, it was Taipei that drove the propaganda effort on the ground. And it was the Kuomintang and the Philippine military, but not the United States, that did the dirty work of identifying and arresting so-called Chinese communists. And so my book is in part a response to historians of the United States and the world. It's partly a response to a critique of the US-Asia binary that structures much of how we understand the Cold War in this region. And so I decenter the United States. I emphasize the agency and relative autonomy of Asian transnational actors in the construction of Cold War anti-communist relations. And these relations exist on multiple levels, between states, but also between states and peoples. And so collectively, this web of relations help constitute what I call adapting anthropologist Susan Bailey's concept of a socialist ecumene, an intra-Asian anti-communist ecumene, which comprised Kuomintang networks, flows of Philippine Chinese students, teachers, and tourists from the Philippines to Taiwan, as well as transnational anti-communist organizations such as the Asian People's Anti-Communist League. So that's my second big argument. And finally, as a work of social and cultural history, my book challenges prevailing narratives of Philippine Chinese history and society that focus on ethnocultural identity and integration. Narratives that also emphasize the business community to the exclusion of Cold War politics and ideology. So if you look at the narratives produced by the community itself, by the Chinoy community, such as this coffee table book produced by the leading Chinoy organization, Kaisa Para Sakalaran, it's quite remarkable how the Kuomintang and Taiwan are conspicuous by their absence. I think this is understandable given that these narratives emphasize the contributions of Chinese migrants and their descendants to a multicultural Filipino nation in response to Chinese racism, which is pretty much endemic to discrimination, to accusations of disloyalty, which unfortunately have intensified in recent years. And so even though Kuomintang hegemony in the Philippines is well known among older Chinoys, as my conversations with them reveal, I think it's politically inconvenient for the community to highlight how an earlier generation of Philippine Chinese were vociferous supporters of a particular China. We find in what little scholarship there is on the post-war Philippine Chinese an inordinate emphasis on the business community, whose interests tend to be depicted as synonymous with those of local society, local Chinese society in general, and whom social scientists tend to depict as simply being uninterested in China-centered politics. Right? The focus has largely been on how these persons came to adapt to the discriminatory economic policies of the Philippine government. And this is characteristic of scholarship on the Chinese and post-colonial Southeast Asia in general. So there's a odd disjuncture between these oddly depoliticized narratives of the post-45 period and narratives of the pre-1945 period that are quite attentive to, how the Chinese were mobilized in support of the war of resistance against Japan, right? Or as Andrew Wilson's book points out, how early 20th century Chinese migrants in the Philippines leveraged their ties with the Chien government in pursuit of social status, in pursuit of their ambitions and identity building. So my argument in response to these narratives is as follows. First, we need to think about how the sharing of sovereignty between Taipei and Manila, how transnational Kuomintang networks and Cold War ideology shaped Chinese identity in the Philippines, how they were instrumental to how the Chinese fashioned themselves as ethno-ideological post-colonial subjects in the face of prejudice and discrimination. Much of the scholarship on Chineseness focuses on questions of hybridity and interculturation. But I think we can go beyond these tropes, beyond the narrow confines of ethnicity and culture, because for many Philippine Chinese, as legal aliens and ethnic minorities performing the right ideology, and I mean that in both senses of the term, an ideology shared by the ROC and the Philippine states, was a means for them to prove that they were good residents of the Philippines. So they may not have been able to secure, they may not have been able to become naturalized citizens of the country, but it was through performing this ideology that they ingratiated themselves with the authorities, for example, won intercommunal power struggles and profited, for example, by the means of criminal activity in the name of anti-communism. And this is an example of some of the activities that I talk about in the book. So ideology in this sense, in my book, is both about belief and expediency. This is a question that came up during my dissertation defense, I believe. Parsing the motivations of persons is always a tricky task for historians. I think we prefer studying manifestations, outward manifestations of sort of inward belief, right? In my case, that would be the performative aspects of Cold War anti-communism. The literary theorist Terry Eagleton has a really excellent definition of ideology as a, quote, suasive or rhetorical rather than veridical kind of speech, concerned less with the situation as it is than with the production of certain useful effects for political purposes. And so from forming civic institutions such as the Chinese Anti-Communist League, to fundraising in support of the ROC, to blackmailing and informing on suspected Chinese communists to the state, these anti-communist social and cultural practices all help Chinese mitigate racial prejudices towards them by emphasizing their ideological bona fides. And not all such practicing anti-communists were Chinese businessmen. I get asked a lot about economic ties between the Philippine Chinese and the ROC, and I do think that such ties existed, but have proven quite difficult to study given the accessibility of archival material. That one finds no references to such ties in, for example, the ROC Foreign Ministry records. More than that, I think from the figures that I've been able to gather, overseas Chinese investment in Taiwan, the Republic of China and Taiwan, only really began increasing in the 1960s. Prior to which, the ROC did not actually need overseas Chinese capital because of the US military aid or non-military aid that it was receiving. But if you look at the Philippine case, we find that enthusiastic, vocal public support for the Republic of China among the Philippine Chinese antedates the 1960s, right? Which suggests to me that investment, to the extent that it existed, was a manifestation of support rather than support being grounded in the material reality of such investment. And furthermore, I would say that my book is not just simply about the business community. While the community certainly supported the ROC, the most committed diasporic Cold Warriors in my book were not men like Lucio Tan and Alfonso Yuchenko, right, well-known sort of Philippine Chinese businessmen. They don't feature in my book at all. They don't appear in the archival records at all. My book is really also about journalists, media figures, educators affiliated with the Kuomintang, members of the party in the Philippines, like Chien, who was the longtime principal of Chiang Kai-shek College. There he is meeting Chiang Kai-shek himself. Right? Persons like the guy on the bottom left, Xin Guangzu, who was editor-in-chief of the Great China Press, which is a Kuomintang newspaper, one of two Kuomintang mouthpieces in the Philippines. Right? He's not featured on the slide, but like a gentleman, a former KMT guerrilla leader in the Philippines who blackmailed and extorted his enemies by accusing them of being anti-communist, being communists. Persons like the radio host Mary Yu, who is shown here again, visiting Taiwan and being presented with a bouquet of flowers. She was a popular radio host in the Philippines. Finally, on the question of ideology, and of course, not forgetting Ma Shuli, whom I talked about earlier. So, finally, on the question of ideology, again, something that came up in my dissertation defense, I believe. In the absence of a Chinese left-wing movement in the Philippines, right, unlike, say, in Indonesia or Malaya, right, where might one turn to for evidence of resistance to the Kuomintang? So my book is a study in hegemony, or near hegemony, but this hegemony was not uncontested. However, this contestation manifested itself indirectly and obliquely as what I call anti-communism or non-anti-communism. It did not manifest itself in the form of full-throated support for the PRC, because this would have been highly inadvisable, right, in the context of the Cold War Philippines. And so the Chinese commercial news, the Huaqiao Shangbao that I was talking about earlier, registered its discomfort with the ideological status quo, the highly right-wing ideological status quo within the community, Chinese community, by publishing articles that took a middle ground, right? That staked out a middle ground that praised and criticized both Chinas. The newspaper critiqued the Kuomintang's ethnocentrism and Chinese chauvinism by performing an alternative multicultural ethno-political subjectivity. And for that reason, the editors of the paper ran afoul of the Kuomintang establishment and were deported to Taiwan. So those are my three sort of historiographical claims about the transnationalism of the KMT, about the sharing of sovereignty between Manila and Taipei in the context of an intra-Asian Cold War, and about the significance of ideology to understanding Chinese identity in a specific Southeast Asian context. I want to close with a few thoughts on the broader implications of the book and where we, scholars of China and the Chinese overseas, can go from here. And so one issue has to do with comparability and translatability. So my book isn't a comparative history. I find that comparative histories are really hard to pull off, especially as when you're a grad student. There are moments in my book when I look beyond the Philippines to other Southeast Asian countries, but I hope that the book supplies concepts and narratives that translate across borders and that can illuminate the Kuomintang elsewhere in the region, about which there's actually little scholarship. But there are rich, and on the other hand, there are rich deposits of primary sources from which to draw, primary sources that are actually quite accessible and do not even require traveling to Taiwan to access. So in writing about shared sovereignty, I also hope that others will think about how colonial and post-colonial states after 1945 constrain the operations of the party, right, among Chinese populations in the name of assimilating them into national body politics. Right? Other states were much more suspicious of the Kuomintang's Sino-centric agenda, and this is why they ended up banning them entirely, for example, in the case of Malaya in 1949. Second, and this goes back to the title of my talk today, I hope that the book can be helpful in historicizing relations between China, quote unquote, and Southeast Asia. And so rather than tracing a linear trajectory between the PRC then and today, I call attention to the ROC as an antecedent to the PRC's involvement in the region in our own time. And so for those of you sort of familiar with scholarship on modern China, you'll know that there's long been an effort to draw comparisons, synchronic comparisons between the KMT and the CCP as sort of authoritarian Leninist regimes. But if we can do that, then we can also engage in what I consider to be diachronic analogizing between the historical KMT and the contemporary Chinese Communist Party. For example, with respect to their shared commitment to promoting certain ideas of Chineseness in Southeast Asia, in their efforts at Sinicizing or re-Sinicizing the region's Chinese population. So it's quite telling that a current employee of the Chinese Commercial News, whose father also worked for the newspaper, said to me once that Beijing's cultural diplomacy among the Philippine Chinese today resembles what Taipei was doing half a century earlier. And finally, I hope that we, and my interlocutors here, I think, are chiefly persons within sort of North American area studies, can move beyond Chinese history as a field that is centered on the mainland as a territorialized space for the unfolding of the quote-unquote Chinese past. And so even excellent recent books on the Chinese diaspora by Shelley Chan and Wayne Soon are China-centric in that they are principally concerned with how the diaspora changed China, right? And in Wayne's case, Wayne Soon's case, the ROC on Taiwan as well. And so I would like to propose an alternative, non-exclusive and constructivist approach, inspired in part by Adam McEwen's scholarship, by critical Han studies, and especially by Sinophone literary and cultural studies. This global Chinese history, if one wants to call it that, emphasizes the experiences of and connections between persons, societies, and states in different settings that saw themselves or were seen and produced by others as Chinese. At the same time, this approach does not limit itself to literary and cultural text, which is how Sinophone studies has operated largely. And within this framework treats Sinicization and de-Sinicization in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia in relation to Manchus, Uyghurs, right, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, Hong Kongers, ethnic Chinese Singaporeans even. It treats these processes of Sinicization, de-Sinicization as comparable processes that span geographies that are enmeshed in, and yet are enmeshed obviously in distinct historical contexts and political processes. And I think this approach has political and ethical ramifications. Right? The terms Chinese and China are powerful but ambiguous and contested signifiers. Racist demagogues and authoritarian states such as the PRC today, the martial law Republic of China, New Order Indonesia under Suharto, have all deployed these terms to categorize, essentialize, and inflict great harm on peoples. And for such reasons, I think we owe it to our peers, right, to the larger public, to problematize this concept of Chineseness and this idea of Chinese history. Thank you very much. I wanted to there was one more slide that I wanted to show. It was just where you can buy the book. There we go. Okay. Yes, there we go. Thank you very much. If you are
30% off.
interested in buying the book, you can do so for 30% off by going to the Cornell University Press website and using the following code. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
So I will, let's see, do we have people online or do I have to worry about that? Or can I just field the questions here? Okay, I'll field questions here. Okay. 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 So thank you, Jinwen, for your presentation on a very clear presentation on your book. So why don't we just open up the floor for questions and discussion? Paul, start us off. Yeah. Introduce yourself just in case.
Oh, yeah. My name is Paul Kreitman.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know via Twitter, but
Okay.
good to meet you in person. So I teach Japanese history, modern Japanese history here at Columbia. So it's a fantastic project. And I have sort of two questions, both of which come from a place of profound ignorance. So indulge me. The first is, can you give us a kind of thumbnail sketch of the demographics of the Chinese community in the Philippines? Are we talking, because I mean, you compared it to both Indonesia and Malaya, where if I understand correctly, there's quite a large migrant worker, plantation worker population. But is it the same here? Or are we talking about mainly kind of business owners, Peranicans and so on? So that's my first question, kind of just a kind of sketch of the demographics of the community. And my second, I suppose, is about where the kind of Philippine state saw, whether it's a place for Chinese in the kind of post-independence world. And so for Indonesia, they're either trying to assimilate and forcibly get people to naturalize or to kick them out, right? There's a sense of you have to become Indonesian or you have to leave. And I think there's a bit of that in Malaya too, maybe. But here it sounds like they actually didn't allow them to naturalize. So I wondered about the kind of how the kind of Philippine national politics envision Chinese and whether they kind of was contingent on this performing of a certain ideological loyalty.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for those questions. So this is one of the smallest Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. It's also one of the oldest, going all the way back to Spanish colonial times. What happens, of course, is that the number of there's in the 19th century, following the Opium Wars, there's a sort of a new influx of so-called new Chinese migrants to the Philippines. This period also coincides, by the end of the century, it also coincides with the shift from Spanish to US rule. And so what happens in the Philippines is that Chinese exclusion is implemented in a few years after it's implemented in this country. And that results, again, that keeps numbers down, but it also sort of, it means that the community is less working class than that of communities in other parts of Southeast Asia. It's a community, again, largely dominated by merchant interests. Hence scholarship, which is why scholarship on the Philippine Chinese tends to be fairly sort of merchant centered. What also happens during the US period is that the US sort of, it takes Chinese who have intermarried with locals and with Spanish settlers, and it sort of recategorizes them as Filipinos. And instead, the label Chinese is applied to newer arrivals from China, newer, less acculturated arrivals from China. I should also have said that unlike elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the vast majority, more Chinese in the Philippines trace their ancestry to Fujian than in any other part of Southeast Asia, and not just Fujian, but one particular county in Fujian. So not unlike sort of how certain counties in Guangdong have sort of contributed to largely to Chinese immigration to this country. So your second question had to do with the Philippine government's attitude after independence. What's distinct about the Philippine government's attitude is that it doesn't really care. The community is small, it's largely unproblematic. The community is more than willing to sort of bend over backwards to accommodate whatever political and economic, political projects the Philippine government has in mind. There is some resistance, obviously, from the community to efforts to economic nationalism and other discriminating legislation, but the Philippine government really goes nowhere near as far as that of, say, in Indonesia. The community is largely left to its own devices, and that's why the
ROC going down is able to exert such influence over the community, because in the eyes of the Filipino elites, the Chinese they're small and they're never going to be fully Filipino, and so we don't actually need to take steps to naturalize them. Naturalization, there's a naturalization law, but it's really hard up until 1972 to become a naturalized Filipino citizen. For China, there are all manner of sort of bureaucratic and bureaucratic hoops to jump through in order to become a naturalized citizen. And for most Chinese, this is simply not worth the effort, unless you have a lot of money, in which case you just pay the judge to grant you citizenship, which is what a lot of wealthier Chinese are able to do. So that relative indifference, right, on the part of the Philippine authorities towards the Filipino Chinese, I think helps explain sort of the dynamics of the community. It explains why the Kuomintang is able to operate fairly openly. The Filipino authorities are like, well, we allow other political parties to operate openly in the country, and after all, these Chinese they're Chinese nationals, and so why shouldn't we allow their government to have a say in their schooling, for example? So that's how the Philippines is distinct from other countries whose authoritarian, and I should say that the Philippines as a democracy, however sort of low quality, is also important. Like, administrations come and go, and to the extent that they come up with, they devise sort of projects targeted at the Chinese community. Again, these projects never ended up being sort of fully implemented. Whereas if you look at more authoritarian regimes in other parts of Southeast Asia, you find that a lot of the assimilation projects are sort of much more coercive, and can be implemented again because of authoritarian rule under Suharto, for example, or under the Thai military government, or in South Vietnam, right, under Eugenia. So that's another way in which the Philippines is sort of distinct. And in Southeast Asian studies, the Philippines is sort of a bit of an odd fit, because for the longest time for a period of time it wasn't considered part of Southeast Asia, right? But it is today. No, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, for the presentation, and congrats again on the publication. So my name is Hao Chen. I'm a postdoc from International Security Studies at Yale. I have a straightforward question regarding your second historiographical intervention, because you mentioned about shared sovereignty. So could you define what sovereignty means to you in that specific context of your research analysis? And since you mentioned about shared sovereignty, what actually was the part of sovereignty that was being shared, and how it was shared, and why do you think actually it was shared? Yeah.
Right. No, thank you. So we typically think of sovereignty in relation to territory, and modern China historians again, and in particular, think of sovereignty in terms of territory. But the scholarship on sovereignty that I've read offers a understanding of sovereignty based on persons, right? Sovereignty over bodies, over individuals, right? As opposed to over space, as opposed to over territory. And that's the kind of understanding of sovereignty that I'm driving at. Now, if you look at, for example, US imperial projects in the Philippines during this period, those tend to be more conventionally territorial in nature, right? The US had military bases in the Philippines, and it exerted economic leverage over the Philippines as well. But we typically, we focus on those military bases as a crucial aspect of understanding US neocolonialism in the Philippines. So shared sovereignty, which again has largely to do with sovereignty over persons, based on legal conceptions of nationality, right? Again, it was about the Philippine government obviously had claims upon these persons, because again, these persons were required to conform to certain Philippine expectations of what a good resident alien should be. On the other hand, of course, much of their education, their formal education was in schools was dominated by the Kuomintang. Much of their extracurricular activities at schools like Chiang Kai-shek College, right, revolved around, again, the celebration and the the exaltation of a certain understanding of Chineseness. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this term shared sovereignty, right? Try to convey a sense in which relations between the Kuomintang and the Philippine state were on a relatively equal footing. The idea that both sides needed each other. The Kuomintang obviously needed the approval of the Philippine authorities to continue operating openly in the Philippines. And conversely, Manila needed the Kuomintang in order to keep tabs, to surveil and police the community. It was a relationship of mutual convenience, and one in which both sides sort of willingly entered into. It sort of emerged sort of organically rather than in the form of treaties stipulating, for example, certain spheres of influence. So that's kind of where I'm getting at using this with this term shared sovereignty.
So when you say policing, you mean jurisdiction? So the Chinese
Yes.
National Police of Crime in the Philippines, the KMT will actually do that.
Well, no, what happens is that, so because they are resident aliens, they're not subjected to sort of the regular judicial process. Instead, if you are a Chinese national and you run afoul of the law, and that can take place in all sorts of ways, you attend hearings before the deportation board. You don't get, not through the regular court process. And the deportation process is highly politicized. You don't have to be guilty of an actual crime to be deported. You can simply be considered undesirable to be and be deported. And the deportation process, again, apparently, according to the law, allows the deportee to choose where he or she ends up. But more often than not, the deportees were sent to Taiwan, right? Which is not something that Taipei necessarily approved of. Taipei was much more interested in persons who were who were of political value rather than sort of petty criminals, for example. But a lot of all sorts of persons ended up in Taiwan, right? Including suspected communists. So yeah, that's how they were. So that sense, they were subject to sort of multiple jurisdictions, but oftentimes these persons, especially if they're sort of considered to be high value political figures, ended up getting tried in Taiwan, right, under martial law. That's what happened to the Yudong brothers, right? They were deported from the Philippines, and that deportation process was, again, highly politicized. And then in Taiwan, they were put on trial and formally charged on the basis of their nationality with being seditious, right? And that happened to a lot of people.
It's so nice that you fleshed that out a little bit, because I think that's the richness of his, actually, sometimes the conceptual stuff is interesting too, but the richness, it really fleshes out what shared sovereignty is, right? When you give that.
Yeah.
And that's a fabulous, just from the dissertation, I remember that was such a fabulous chapter. The Rethinking brothers who are so a little bit, and they weren't alone. There were other shady types getting deported and then tried in Taiwan.
They were not shady. They were not
shady.
shady. But there were some shady characters.
You should share them in your next slide.
Okay.
Those are always fun to hear about. Yes, yeah.
How does the concept of non-China centric Chineseness work out? What does mean non-China centric Chineseness?
So again, coming back to sort of this question of territory, I think, which informs so much of our understandings of Chinese history, or at least that's the understanding of it that I took away from all the years that I spent at Columbia. Maybe if Adam McEwen had been around for a little longer. No, anyway, the idea is that China, or the borders of People's Republic, or whatever the borders are, is the legitimate and the primary space for the unfolding of something that we call Chinese history. That's what I would consider to be a conventional area studies based understanding of Chinese history, and it's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with it, but for all sorts of reasons, I think we can go beyond that understanding of Chinese history by emphasizing not so much the territoriality of China, but rather the questions of what it means to be Chinese. Questions that not only societies, individuals and societies necessarily grapple with, but which states grapple with as well, right? So Chinese identity is not something simple. It's not simply a matter of self-identification.
contextual self-identification. Like in Singapore, for example, I would identify myself as ethnically Chinese, but I don't when I'm in this country. So on the one hand, it has to do with questions of self-identification, but it also has to do again with how identities are constructed from above. There's a great article by I think Fred Cooper, right, in his book Colonialism in Question on this question of identity. He much prefers the term identification because that allows us to sort of specify who's identifying whom. And if we look beyond China or within and beyond China, we find that multiple regimes have gone out of the way to identify certain persons as Chinese, and those consequences actually do matter. And so again, this is very much comes out of Sinophone studies and which seeks to call attention to the constructedness of Chineseness and the multiple ways of being Chinese. And so my point is not that, Chinese history, that by labeling, say, what I do as Chinese history, it isn't also, say, Philippine history or Southeast Asian history, right? The understanding of Chineseness that I'm trying to, or Chinese history that I'm evangelizing on behalf of is very much what I as I mentioned, a non-exclusivist approach. It can and should overlap with other sort of other frameworks for understanding the past. So I'm not making the claim that Taiwanese history is Chinese history. Taiwanese history and Chinese history aren't necessarily can coexist with each other, depending on what you're focusing on, right? In my case, my interest in Taiwan is from that of someone who studies the state, is chiefly interested in the state and its partisans who considered themselves to be part of Chinese history, part of China, right? This is not to deny, for example, the Taiwanese-ness of Taiwanese history, which again, I think we should be doing more of, but which isn't really a concern of the book.
Right, Jai, you had your hand up? And maybe someone can pass the microphone back to her.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful talk. I'm Jai. I'm a master's student at ELAC.
Could you speak up a bit?
I'm Jai. I'm a master's student at ELAC, and I wonder if you can elaborate more on the U.S. side and the relationship between the U.S. and Kuomintang in the Southeast Asia during the Cold War. Since we witnessed a growing U.S. intervention in Southeast Asia at a time when Southeast Asia was considered as a key location to prevent a domino effect of the spread of communism. And I wonder if you can talk about did the U.S. support the propaganda of the KMT, or was there a competitive relationship between the U.S. and the KMT, and how do you configure the relationship in the Cold War context?
Yeah. Okay. So there's the United States was very much interested in sort of Chinese overseas communities in Southeast Asia. This is, my friend Yu Wen-Ching has written a book, also part of Weatherhead, the Studies of Weatherhead series, Arc of Containment, which talks again. He's a U.S. foreign relations historian, and so he talks extensively about how the U.S. this idea of the domino effect actually stemmed from U.S. fears of Chinese communist expansion in Southeast Asia via overseas Chinese communities. This is a sort of a non-Vietnam War approach to understanding the domino effect. And the U.S. archives, again, if you look at the U.S. archives, there's extensive material on the overseas Chinese. If you look at the archives of the Asia Foundation at Stanford, for example, there's extensive evidence of U.S. involvement in Chinese communities. Though again, chiefly from the perspective of propaganda, that the U.S. is very interested in getting these persons to depoliticizing these persons, or politicizing them in a different way, right? And getting them to sort of identify not so much with China, or if they did identify China, with the right China, right? And that's very evident from sort of the U.S. archives. But in the Philippines, again, the Philippines it's weird because, of course, the U.S. exerted a huge role in Philippine history. What I found, though, is that when you look at the Taiwanese materials, there's very little mention of the United States. the meetings that these Kuomintang officials in the Philippines, they're taking place in the absence of sort of US of the US presence. That the operations launched against suspected Chinese communists in the Philippines are taking place without US knowledge. The US is like, why? No one told us about this. So that was really interesting to me. And the reason that I came up with is that the US had bigger fish to fry in the Philippines. Those of you familiar with Philippine history, right? So the 50s and 60s are characterized by communist insurgency on the part of sort of peasant rebels called the Hukbalahap against the independent Philippine government. And what's really interesting to me is that even though fears of Chinese communism in the Philippines, again, were linked to this insurgency, there was actually there were very few ties between the remnants of the Chinese left in the Philippines and the Hukbalahap. One of my chapters actually explains how the remnants of the Chinese left in the Philippines tried to reconnect with the Filipino left, but were simply unable to do so. And so that's, again, evidence of the relative unimportance of the Chinese left to sort of the US Cold War project in the Philippines, which is very much, again, focused on indigenous Filipino communists whose relations with the Chinese left were neither extensive nor especially cordial, I feel. There was a sense in which, a lot of the Chinese leftists who participated in an earlier period in leftist politics in the Philippines tended to be a little full of themselves and tended to see themselves as better Marxists than their Filipino counterparts, which did not go down well with their Filipino leftists.
Charmaine.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk. My name is Charmaine. I'm a first-year PhD student in the history department over at NYU. And I'm curious to hear if you could elaborate more on kind of the intersection or the interplay between the political and the cultural in kind of in this Sinicization and de-Sinicization among Filipino Chinese, as well as this idea of the history of Chineseness.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm particularly interested in this because I'm working at the intersections of British imperial history and Chinese history, with a particular focus on Hong Kong and the Straits Settlement.
Okay. Yeah, so Sinicization Sinicization is a political project, full stop. In its multiple iterations, Sinicization, whether carried out by the PRC, by the ROC, or by my government, is a political project. In the specific, in that it seeks to, because this project seeks to advance a certain understanding of Chineseness for the sake of certain political projects, right? In the names of, whether in the name of capitalism or communism, or in this case, Chinese nationalism. So this is very much the Kuomintang is very much a Sinocentric organization, in that it understands, it has a racialized, culturalist understanding of Chineseness. And this is what it does in China. It's what it gets up to in Taiwan with respect to those uncivilized, half Japanized Taiwanese, right? Who need to be re-educated and brought back into the fold of Chinese civilization. And this is what it tries to do overseas as well, because it needs, by getting Chinese persons or persons to identify themselves as Chinese, it's again, in the context of the Cold War, it's about demonstrating that even though it's lost the mainland, it can still draw upon, it can still call upon people who are Chinese and who are part of this global overseas Chinese nation. And that's why education and ideological indoctrination are so important to the Kuomintang, right? It's especially Southeast Asia, obviously, is especially important because that's where most overseas Chinese are to be found. And there's a constant fear on the part of these sort of chauvinists, Chinese Kuomintang chauvinists, that these persons are going to go native, that could become localized, and that therefore they need proper traditional Chinese education in order to in order for their identities to be maintained. And what's interesting is that during this period, the PRC is much less, doesn't really care that much. Like in Indonesia, for example, it's much more laissez-faire about questions of citizenship. It's Zhou Enlai says that if Chinese in Indonesia want to become Indonesian citizens, we will respect that. If they want to identify with as PRC nationals, we will welcome them back into the fold. But the PRC's approach is a lot less chauvinistic during this particular period. It's the ROC that's advancing a much more Sinocentric understanding of Chineseness, right? Partly because of its own revolutionary tradition, partly because its very existence in its own understanding comes out of the overseas milieu, right? That the overseas Chinese are the mother of the revolution, right? So it had from the late 19th century onwards, if you look at its the narratives that it spins about its own history, it's very much these overseas Chinese whom it identifies as Huaqiao, they are integral to our development as a revolutionary organization, and therefore we owe it to them to, we ought to continue maintaining ties with them, right? And in part because of sort of context and this incompleteness, this territorial incompleteness that I keep on going back to, right? The ROC, what is the Republic of China? Where do its borders lie from 1912 onwards? Right? So yeah, that's how I understand sort of Sinicization as a deeply political project. Are there questions from people online?
John, did you have a question? Do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
I wonder how centralized was the allegiance of these Kuomintang adherents in the Philippines
How centralized?
to Jiang Jieshi.
Yeah, they
I
were.
wonder what
I mean,
was his role.
So what's, if you recall the slide earlier, which the flow chart that I showed earlier, what's the Kuomintang's infrastructure had this elaborate infrastructure for diasporic mobilization. Both the party and the state had sort of specific organs that targeted these overseas Chinese communities. So and there was an Overseas Chinese Affairs Commission. What's interesting is that which is today the Overseas Community Affairs Council in Taiwan, although the Chinese name is still Hua Qiao. So the Kuomintang had a really sort of centralized infrastructure, right? The embassies, party branches, again, there were different levels of party branches. There were branches, there were sub branches, and there were sub branches. And in theory, at least, these various branches were all sort of organized hierarchically and reported to each other, and reported to the main branch in a particular country, which then provided, right, filtered information back to Taipei, right, back to the central committee. So on the party side of things, as opposed to the state side of things, these overseas branches were theoretically, on paper at least, subordinate to the central committee. They're answerable to the central committee, and specifically to the section 3 of the central committee, right? So section 3 was the section dedicated to overseas Chinese affairs. Were they loyal to Chiang Kai-shek? They were. The visits that they made to Taiwan invariably involved audiences with the Generalissimo, right? They were, again, these are very ritualistic and highly scripted occasions, right? And they involved, it was, all manner of people got secured photo ops with Chiang Kai-shek, right? He was more or less, by the 50s, he was increasingly sort of a symbol rather than a sort of an actual administrator. So he would receive overseas Chinese delegations, students, business elites at his Yangmingshan residence. He would, and these were highly scripted occasions. He would sort of, they would gather in a waiting room. He would appear. He would give a sort of a prepared speech. There would be a photo op. Then that was it. And these people were the Kuomintang partisans were very much about paying lip service to Chiang Kai-shek, right? To sort of upholding and sustaining his sort of his cult of personality. And you see that from the images that I showed, all of which again official images taken, found in Academia Historica, in which people present Chiang Kai-shek with gifts, symbolically meaningful gifts, right? In which Chiang Kai-shek is shown to be greeting ecstatic members of these overseas Chinese communities who have come to pay their respects to him. So yeah, it was, they were very much about, Chiang Kai-shek as a leader of the so-called free world.
So I have a quick question. Xuexing, did you have a question? Why don't you go ahead first? Yeah.
Xuexing, a PhD student here at Columbia. A very quick question. But I think you mentioned at the earlier part of your presentation that there were Filipino Chinese students who actually crossed borders, went from Philippines to Taiwan, and they were doing military service,
Yeah.
I'm very curious about these human bodies that move, into Taiwan, or then again out of Taiwan back to Philippines. What the KMT state, party state, ever suspicious of these moving bodies? I'm asking this question because temporally parallel context in PRC, the Chinese students or later refugees from Indonesia, and then in the late 1970s from Vietnam were placed on state-owned farms.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, part of which is basically suspicion and distrust, at least at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there was any suspicion on the KMT part.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
in the PRC context, these so-called returned overseas Chinese, right? These Guiqiao were initially, they were often suspect because again, these were persons who had spent a lot of time in interacting with sort of foreign elements in various sort of, especially in sort of various colonial contexts. And so there came a time when these persons had to be reinserted into sort of PRC society and transformed into model socialist citizens. Although again, many of them continue to enjoy certain privileges by virtue of their partial foreignness. In Taiwan, of course, so Taiwan's under martial law, and Taiwan is much less welcoming in some ways to foreigners, including, interestingly enough, overseas Chinese. Right? So it's quite happy, for example, to have overseas Chinese study at universities in Taiwan. This is something that the Kuomintang was quite eager to promote, but less so to sort of settle in Taiwan. Taiwan, again, is facing a demographic. All those mainlanders that crossed the strait contributed to a huge demographic problem for Taiwan. So it wasn't keen on overseas Chinese sort of returning to Taiwan to settle there, to take up sort of extended residence there. This was somewhat different, I think, from sort of the PRC context. And so because of these, what happened, of course, is that the ROC was very keen when it did admit these persons, it subjected them to considerable vetting. Right. And when these tour groups did come to Taiwan, again, they were on these, it was not a matter of, you couldn't just go there for leisurely travel. You had to adhere to certain itineraries. And these itineraries typically were organized by associations in the Philippines. They came with a code of conduct. No wandering off, no wandering off. Stick to the itinerary, speak Mandarin, not so-called dialect. And the ROC would actually assign sort of persons to accompany these tours to answer any questions that they might have about Taiwan or the progress of free China, as the propaganda that I've read puts it. So these, again, the ROC was very careful about the kinds of persons that they admitted.
And it could do so again because of because there was a military regime in place, and border controls were considerable.
So I have a question, a quick question. So you use in your title anti-communism,
Mhm.
and in your talk you use fascism quite freely. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask whether, so my understanding of how you're, at least based on the presentation, anti-communism it's a political stance and a posture. This is a period of the Cold War, and the mobilization is done in vis-a-vis, against China, communist China. But then you do use the term fascism. And so I wanted to understand how was diasporic mobilization by the Kuomintang fascists?
Okay.
And is it different from, say, the fascists? Because fascism is partially defined by processes of mobilization that are radically different from communist class mobilization.
Yeah.
So if you are kind of trying to conceptualize fascism and its practices, and the processes by which mobilization occurs in mass politics, right? That's what fascism by definition is about, right? This, do you see a change from, say, some of the work that Brian Sway has done, right? In the sense of fascism within a nation state bound? Because I really like the idea of diasporic mobilization, and I'm wondering if you're linking it to kind of conceptualization of fascism.
Yeah, actually, I'm not. I bring up fascism solely to describe the origins of the Kuomintang in the Philippines in the 1930s. And so, again, it's something I'm going to talk about in the book. In the 1930s, there obviously is a Kuomintang in the Philippines, which has been there since the turn of the 20th century. What happens is that a bunch of Kuomintang activists from China arrive in the Philippines in the 1930s and succeed in more or less taking over the local organization. And these include people like Ma Shuli, right? And a lot of these persons who arrived in the 1930s, and for the purposes of anti-Japanese mobilization, are persons who were trained at or received sort of like paramilitary training in China, and persons whom, as far as I can tell, right, had ties to the blue shirts, to the Renaissance society, and so they're able to sort of. And this group sort of takes over the Kuomintang, was able to sort of establish, unify sort of the different Kuomintang factions by the end of the Second World War. It's not, so I don't use the term to talk about what happens subsequently, but it's quite clear that I'm not sure if I will call the post 49, I'm not sure if I will call it fascist, but it certainly is much more stridently anti-communist than, there are different factions of the Kuomintang, right? And including a left Kuomintang. I'm not sure if I would use the term to describe the party after 1949. There's certainly, arguably fascist elements who are part of the party, but I think a lot of these fascist elements are somewhat are Chinese, but they're outsiders to the community in the Philippines, the community that is dominated by sort of business interests. So even though I talk about more than just sort of business elites, I think there's a sense in which these fascist elements in like journalism and in education had to sort of make compromises with sort of the established leadership structure within the community, which is much more pragmatic, much more flexible, right? Which in part explains why they are quick to adjust tactically, strategically to the prevailing political climate, right? Which again proves to be tremendously helpful for them, because it helps ensure their legitimacy within the community, it renders them sort of safe, ideologically correct to the authorities. And it's part of this process of adaptation. I'm not sure I would call it fascist. I don't find very much what I would consider to be sort of fascist language. A lot of it is very, a lot of it is just boilerplate Kuomintang propaganda. What's interesting is that this language of the Kuomintang, the official language of Fang Dongkang, right, sort of just seeps into sort of everyday discourse. It appears, it just these stock phrases just sort of appear all the time. It's as if in all manner of contexts, right? And it's almost as if sort of members of the community have just gotten used to inserting these phrases into their publications as proof of their compliance, or their willingness to sort of go along with what's considered to be correct. So I'm not sure I would use the term fascist. I know that it's like a huge debate, right, on the applicability of the term fascist to various contexts these days.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you were doing it.
Yeah.
I did hear it mentioned sometimes, but okay,
Mhm.
great. Any other?
Were there questions from people online or no?
Okay, well, I have another question. Dongxin, yeah.
Hi, thank you, Jen. So I have a factual question. So it appears that the Kuomintang was most successful, right, in claiming its sovereignty in the Philippines, and for various reasons you've mentioned, particularly for the particularities of Philippines as a state. And so I'm just wondering, so in terms of Kuomintang's own efforts, was the Philippines actually the major target of its investment, or actually Kuomintang was invested in much more heavily, like in other overseas trans communities?
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? Because this is not the Kuomintang. Honestly, if you look at the Philippine publications by the community, they don't make, including publications by the business community, which was very keen to sort of, which left behind quite a sizable sort of publication record. You don't find many references to sort of, to the extent they talk incessantly about the Republic of China, but they don't construct the Republic of China as a place where, in sort of economic and capitalist terms, their economic their focus is very much on how can we come to terms with economic nationalism in the Philippines? How do we manage the after effects? How do we lobby the Philippine government, right, in opposition to these nationalization laws that the Philippine government starts promoting from the mid-1950s onwards? And they try, and they're largely unsuccessful, but they find all sorts of ways around that. So Taiwan doesn't really figure in their imaginaries as a place, in economic terms. In fact, the language they use to describe Taiwan is highly romanticized in some ways. It's very sort of, it's very cliched. But it doesn't, and there are these references obviously to Taiwan, to modernization, and we need to contribute to the ongoing efforts to counterattack the mainland and so on. But it never actually, they never talk about material lending, and they talk about donating money, fundraising on behalf of Taiwan. They talk about donating like radios and other objects to sort of the war effort, right, to helping with like relief efforts in Jimren, in Quemoy, for example. But there's very little talk of Taiwan as a place where one should park one's money. And if you think about it, I don't think Taiwan was an especially safe investment at the time, compared to, say, Hong Kong. And presumably, if one did enough researching sort of private companies and flows of sort of private capital and private banking is really hard, because these banks are not, typically do not let people look at their books, right? So that's an obstacle that I encountered, and I hope someone can pick up where I pick up this line of inquiry.
Good. I think we're drawing to a close, and let's give Professor Gong another round of applause.
Thank you. Really enjoyed myself.
Yeah.
Good. All right.